Bueno, y ahora es turno para escuchar a Yasaman Sherry. Ella viene del Instituto de Diseño de Copenhague, es directora creativa y diseñadora en el campo de lo sensorial y de la percepción. Seguimos percibiendo, seguimos con lo sensorial. Welcome, thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. Un aplauso, por favor. Bienvenida.
I'm a faculty at the Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design. I was going to talk about it.
Yeah.
I will. But I work as a faculty member, yeah. And I work with the senior founding team to think about the future of the school and what kind of maybe work we might be doing in design. So I'll talk a little bit about it, but I started this sensory design course and the biodesign course. So, and we've started an initiative in Costa Rica and around biodiversity and biology. And there I'm also kind of helping the senior leadership think about where biology and design can have a synergy.
How did you start in the sensory world? Why?
Yeah, I mean, the whole talk is going to be about that.
Well, just to cause a little bit of mystery, we have prepared this for you. But how did you start in the sensory world?
I can say I've always been interested in smell as an interface, but just as a way that we navigate the world. It's kind of one of those senses that we just don't really think about, and it's neglected. Also, I'm an immigrant, so I moved from Iran to Canada, if you're all wondering where I'm from, because everyone in Spain is wondering where I'm from. So a big part of my life has been thinking about the culinary experiences in my country and in my immigrated countries. So this in-between has been really interesting for me, but also from a design perspective, where the future of design is going, and why we care about, for instance, interfaces being visual. I think if you think about all the phones and laptops and everything that you have is completely visual interface. So I think there's a gap there in terms of how we're thinking about design. And for me, smell and taste and food and haptics, touch, these are really interesting senses that are underexplored in the field of design. And when I discovered them, or not discovered them, everyone experiences it, but when I began to kind of explore that, it's very apparent that they're experts in the fields. For instance, there's perfumers, there are chefs, but designers think from kind of different perspectives, so having them involved is fascinating, and I wanted to explore what that's like with my students.
I don't know if this is not yet, I think. Yasaman, would you say that you, I asked Judith if she's got more sense. I know, come on, sit down with me. Whenever it's ready, we'll continue. Sure. Is that okay? Yes? I think it's going to be ready. No, I'm sorry about you as well. I'm sorry, everybody. I was asking Judith if she thinks she smells more now that she's very sensitive to smelling. What about you?
Oh, for sure. I think smell is totally something that we can educate ourselves around.
All right.
Just by paying attention to how we interact with the world or how we smell. I think that's understood among smell artists or smell educators, or anyone in the world of smell understands that this is something we can educate around. Actually, Judith was talking a little bit about kind of this awareness and matching and conditioning of like good smell, bad smell, and I think that's a form of education around smell. You can also think about, from a young age, we allow kids to sit in front of TV or sit in front of these devices that are completely visual and auditory based, but we don't, for instance, explore different kinds of senses. Or if we do, it's a cultural thing. So for instance, maybe in Spain, you might do it because food is an important part of your life, but maybe in some other cultures, not as much. So I think it's definitely something for me that I educate myself around. And I smell very well, but I don't recognize very well.
Okay.
So I think there's layers to how education works. And for instance, my partner doesn't smell very well, but he knows what smell it is. So I'm like, I know that smell. Something smells really strong. And he's like, it's banana. Oh, it is banana. So I think there's something happening about recognition that's also part of the education.
How can you teach somebody to smell better? I never consider about, if I smell well or not. But
Well, I want to stay away from words like better or good or bad, because I think it's just being able to smell, and then diversifying the language around smell, but also being able to smell things that you never smelled before, or connecting it to things. I think there's a dichotomy, or there's a challenge around how we communicate smell, and I think it's a lot of this language of better or worse, good or bad, and I think that's very binary, and I think there's a spectrum in how we can think about smell. So if that's something we could explore as education, that would be great. But I'm also not a smell expert, so I would hesitate to dictate how we should educate around that.
And just continue with the smelling thing, because I'm very shocked about something else, and it's all this quantity of smells. Would you say countries smell? Does San Sebastian smell in a different way?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I actually think cities smell. Like, I travel a lot, and whenever I step into Paris, or let's say New York City, or Seattle, for instance, they have different smells. And for instance, I feel like they do. I don't know if it's like a personal thing.
Someone, thank you so much for
Thanks for filling in.
Thank you.
Thank you. My laptop's moved. Okay, so
But there
I
you
use
go.
clicker.
Yeah.
Great, no problem.
So you have to tell us if San Sebastian smells in a different way.
Yeah, I'd love to actually. Well, I can tell you the airport smells very strong of chemicals. But I'm really excited about San Sebastian. So hello everyone, thank you for waiting with me. And I hope you endure my jet lag. I'm really jet lagged. I'm coming from New York City, and I want to tell you what I am, but I also want to tell you what I want to not be. So I'm a designer. I studied industrial design many years ago, and I transitioned into interaction design for the last 8 to 10 years. I also like to think that I'm a curator, because I like to curate not just works, but also how to think and maybe ways of thinking. I'm a professor, I'm a writer, and a very amateur surfer, and I love food. So a little bit about my background, although I'm not going to be talking about it most of the time. Usually I dive into it, but for this time I think we don't need to talk about it, so I'll just touch on it. I was one of the first designers on the Microsoft HoloLens operating system team, so I worked in augmented reality. Windows, everyone knows Windows, Microsoft. I worked on the Windows for holographic interfaces for 5 years, and then later on, which kind of looks like, it started looking like that, and then it moved on to looking more like a product. And then what the inside looked at is what I basically did with my team. And later on, we moved to it being a spectrum, so it wasn't augmented reality, it was also mixed reality, which is kind of like a mix between virtuality and augmented. I don't want to get into it, but ultimately I did some also VR work where I thought about avatars and so on. Later on, just like Judith, I also worked at Google, Google X, which is the research arm of Google, and I worked on autonomous vehicles. But the reason I want to talk about these things just briefly is that all of these things, all of these machines have one thing in common, and what they have in common is sensors. And we've designed these electronic sensors that we add on to, let's say, wearables or machines that move around, like cars, and they begin to see things, they begin to perceive things in a way that we might not, or we might model them as we might. So
You don't have
for me, this was really interesting. This was probably the most interesting part of the work that I did. And leaving Microsoft, it always takes time for things to ship. I wasn't at Microsoft while this shipped, but this is something I worked on for a long time, which was kind of the gestural interactions of how you move something, how you rotate something like a hologram. So I'm really proud of this work, but ultimately, the question I began to ask myself, to answer wherever you are, your question, around why am I interested in the senses, because I was beginning to understand that I'm augmenting my sense of self, and I'm augmenting the sense of space that I am around. So I began to kind of realize that the work that I'm doing is not actually just design, it's also objects that sense and working with machine perception. And machine perception is something I like to call, because you are adding this sensory data to it and also sensors to it, so it's beginning to perceive the world in a certain way. So one thing that I noticed while I began to work in this field for the last 8 years is a new kind of materiality was beginning to emerge. And that was kind of a digital materiality, but also my perception of sound, my perception of visual entities in the world. But for me, this is really interesting when we begin to think about sensory systems and ecology. So I wanted to go beyond that. And the first question I ask is, well, why are we just doing vision and sound? I am a human being, and as I walk through space, I already feel so much. And so our machines are missing that, but I'm not interested necessarily to think about how can we create machines that are like us, but it was kind of a moment of reflection for me to think about what is the sensory world and what does design's role in connecting with the senses. So historically, artists have been thinking about this for a really long time. These are some artists thinking about vision and augmenting vision. So I was really inspired to actually think about how I can bring this into a curriculum and think with my design students at the time that I joined CIID, to CIID's Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design, to think about how we can very in a lo-fi, low fidelity, and kind of scrappy way to imagine futures together around augmentation. A little bit about Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design. I joined in 2015 as faculty, and it was founded by Simona Masci, who is the CEO, and Ali Rose, who came from Ivrea, which was the first interaction design school in the world, founded by Bill Moggridge. And this is Bill Moggridge, and Bill Moggridge is a really important person in the world of design, and I just want to very quickly say RIP, rest in peace, and just want to tell you a little bit about him. He founded the company IDEO, I-D-E-O, and that's the company that really began to think about design has a seat at the table, design thinking, and so on. But he also was the first, he was the director at Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. It's also one of the first design museums in the world. As well, finally, he was one of the first people who coined the term interaction design and created the first laptop. So, very interesting person. Him, along with Bill Verplank, who also talks about this kind of drawing, are all part of CIID, and CIID kind of comes from this history of interfaces and what are interfaces that we design. Actually, when we talk about interaction design historically, we're talking about this kind of stuff, and everyone knows these are early ideas of what we call interfaces. They're essentially portals into a digital space that you use with a physical object. Today we call them consumer electronics. But what I love about CIID today in 2019 is that no course whatsoever thinks about a screen. In fact, none of the courses ever teach a designer, an interaction designer, to design with a 2D screen. So I'm really excited that I can embark upon this school and begin to think about the other senses. So for me, coming from Microsoft, thinking about virtual reality, geolocated sound, haptics, all these super high-tech world that is thinking about vision and sound and kind of a little bit of touch. I began to read a lot about new technologies that were coming about with food and with smell. So one of them was the first in vitro burger. Everyone knows about that one. It's $11,000. That became a kind of a very provocative moment for me and my students, because it kind of divided the class about what genetic modification is. And that was like one of the first ways that we began to talk about food. For some other technologies that I embarked upon, especially in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, where technology is moving very, very fast, is the tomato tuna. It's the genetically modified tomato with some genes of a tuna that actually makes the tomato have the same mouthfeel as tuna and flavors. And then the microbial smell created by microbes, essentially perfumes created by microbes, or smells created by microbes from Ginkgo Bioworks, the company. So I proposed, well, they actually asked me to, after a talk that I gave, to create the first sensory design curriculum at Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design, with the goal that we would not focus on vision necessarily, and we would think about the other senses. So the way I start my class is by bringing a lot of objects that augment our sense of perception, but they're analog, and even not always we use objects. For instance, the students know each other for a really long time, and I ask them to sit in front of each other and one group closes their eyes, and they're supposed to guess who the other person is through touch. So just trying to kind of step outside of their everyday practices of visual. Some of the work that the students have done are thinking about sensing from the third-person perspective. So here the student is trying to see herself in third person. She also smelled herself in third person. She also heard herself in third person. Everyone knows the telephone machine call. Some of the students are trying to build a prototype around how two people can feel each other through their heartbeat, and taking heartbeat data and translating it into rings, digital rings that are kind of moving out towards each other, and with the goal that they can sync their own heartbeat together as one. Other students are thinking about touch and movement of the gesture, and thinking about kind of using their hand as a way to manipulate or kind of control together as a collective an installation that might be much bigger than themselves. But so far, up until this moment, I've talked to you about visual, sound, and touch. Well, I'll talk about, one more. This one, the student is thinking about what does it feel like to read something. So for instance, you might be reading a novel, and you might be reading the word warm ocean feel, and maybe there's a glove that they can feel the haptics of a warm ocean feel. They also build speculative projects, so thinking about what the future could look like. Maybe there is some recording of smells, and how would that look like, and so on. But up until this moment, I've talked mostly about the senses that are primary. We wanted to focus on food specifically and smell, and it was really hard because I'm not a food scientist and I'm not a chef, but Copenhagen has a history of Noma is a big, important restaurant in Copenhagen. So we collaborated, instead of doing it all by myself, I collaborated with chefs at Nordic Food Lab, which is Noma's older R&D space. And here we took the students to the food lab, and we were talking about the anti-gin, which is a gin created from ants, and trying to think about what perception might be in design. We also take the students to Amas, which is a 100% zero waste restaurant, where Chef Matthew is actually talking to the students about how he thinks genetic engineering is the doom, is like the worst future in the world. But also after talking to the chef, who is thinking about zero waste and building ways to create zero waste systems, the students are actually beginning to think about how they can participate in this kind of waste system. Even though he's thinking about taste and flavor, the students begin to think about systems with him. Oops. Oh, that's a video. It's okay. But also now the students begin to think about, well, how can I perceive my reality if and food experiences if it wasn't necessarily designing the dish, but the atmosphere of the dish. So they did experiments around what the atmosphere could look like, if there's sun, if there's no sun, if it's inside, if it's not, if you're sitting with someone that you love versus not. So kind of these more perceptual feelings of how you experience flavor. And this particular student, she's actually from Barcelona, and she decided that I don't want to design food because that's not my expertise, but what I want to design is the experience of food being more thoughtful, which I appreciate that you also talked about. So she designed the giant button that upon mealtime you can hit and it turns off the Wi-Fi. So no one gets to use their phone in the household if you can kind of disrupt these digital systems, but also to bring mindfulness to the moment that you eat. Of course, just like everyone else who talked about, we also do very quick exercises like blocking your nose and thinking about how important smell is, or what are the perceptions around insect, or what is it like to eat together, and so on. So we do lots of little exercises with the design students to think about taste and food. But also, I think one of the things that designers do really well that I think maybe is a part of our culture is sketching very lo-fi ideas, and they could be ridiculous or they could be crazy, but we put them all down because no idea is a bad idea, and we have time for collaboration and brainstorming, but we also have time for critique, and we separate these two very much because critiquing early ideas is not very healthy for ideas to kind of flourish and for innovation to happen. So we're really excited about crazy ideas and putting them out in paper. But also we act it out, so we LARP it out. So what is it like to experience around different contexts? And here they're designing around smell and around maybe things that are the in-between of food and not food. So for instance, your toothpaste has a flavor and a smell. What does it feel like? What are the experiences around that? And so on. Coming back to smell, so that was kind of a taste and food. We also explore smell, but again, as designers, we're not interested in building a perfume. We could be, but it's not the ultimate goal. We're also not interested in necessarily building household products that have smells. So for instance, that's a big industry like your soap or your laundry detergent. Instead, we're interested in what are new ways that we can educate around smell and find vocabulary, because there's not a lot of vocabulary around talking about smell. So for instance, most of the vocabulary that we use is making an analogy to food. Or things that already exist, like it smells like cigarettes, something that exists. It smells like banana, something that exists. We don't have actual words to define things just like we do with sour and sweet and so on. So here the students are trying to define new language by drawing it or by putting it in Google Maps. We go for smell walks and they begin to smell all sorts of things and begin to record it in the way that they think makes sense and write down and share their thinking. But I also think it's really important, again, to collaborate with people that are experts in the field. So here we did a project in Art Center College in Berlin with Sissel Tolas, who's a smell artist. And here, just like yourself, we blindfolded. But instead, we decided to put different textures, and the students kind of did this workshop around what they felt like each different smell was. And Sissel Tolas has a big research lab, so she has all sorts of smells. So we actually used a variety of smells, like smell of smoke, the smell of a man running, a smell of meat, and so very, very diverse kind of smells, and just trying to connect that with touch and what that perception could be. Outside of that, we also, Bill Muggeridge, coming back to Bill Muggeridge for a second, he coined the term human-centered design, and you'll find it in maybe a lot of startups. People talk about human-centered design is to put the human first. And for that time, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was really important because human wasn't even part of the technology equation. But today, I'm actually going to critique that and say that we shouldn't just focus on humans, we should also think about other living things. So here, we think about the sensing from a perspective of other species. So here we're trying to learn about the microbes and the germs that are around us, and fermentation, and maybe how fermentation, but also maybe biotechnology could be possible outcomes for ways that we can learn about the living things around us. So here the students are looking at some samples that they swap themselves, so they pick up and they put in a petri dish and it grows and so on. All this to say that the course itself has been part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we're really excited because this education around the senses is not just about fun and good tasting and good smelling. It's also around maybe some of the biggest challenges that we have ahead and how important they are and how design can be a part of that. So, to come to some topics around where could design fit in food, because we're not thinking necessarily about flavor, we're not chefs. I think these are some areas that designers could participate in with experts like yourselves, like well-being, or trust, or perception, access, children, or systems thinking, mobility, and so on. I like to think cultural diversity, but also biodiversity. And so for me, these new materials of sensing for designers are flavor and smell, even though for you as a chef, those are the first materials of working with. So for us, it's new. So I talked a little bit about my teaching methodology and my teaching, but I also want to quickly touch upon, I don't know how much time I have. Do I have time? Okay. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience at Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a synthetic biology company. There, I actually I did a fellowship there, kind of like a residency. And here, I was interested in how can we sense smell and taste, but what are the technology around sensing smell and taste? Like our nose, how does our nose actually sense? Well, it turns out it's a biosensor. And biosensor is actually a protein, a living thing that's inside of us or outside of us. And it's connecting to a molecule, like a smell molecule or a flavor molecule, and they have all these different shapes because they're different biosensors. So for instance, there's a biosensors for sex pheromone, there's biosensor for the smell of smoke, there's a biosensor for the flavor of fish, and so on. And they have all these different shapes because actually the molecules have different shapes as well. And there at Ginkgo, I had a chance to embed this kind of biosensors into both living things, like that's E. coli and yeast, and the E. coli is actually smelling the certain kind of smell, but also producing flavors through microbes. So the microbes are engineered to have this kind of ability to produce flavor, but also producing engineering microbes that also can sense the flavor. So thinking about sensors in a new way was really interesting for me. And finally, I wanted to embed it into something that's physical, that we can understand. So paper became an interesting material for me, and I began to build new kinds of sketches, you can call them sketches, of interfaces of what could these biosensors look like. Could I wear them? Could I have them on my bookshelf? Could they sense when they come across maybe poison or toxin? Maybe as I close my napkin, it can sense that actually I'm sick, and so on. Can it sense hormones? Because there's also hormone sensor. And what do these look like and live in our daily life, both from an object perspective, but also urban environment? And so sketching these ideas was really important for me as part of Ginkgo Bioworks. And I want to finish off by just talking about what's important to me, which is building diverse futures. We talk about futures. We talk about future, the future, and we say, the future is going to look like this. But I think there's a multiplicity of futures to be had, and I'm really interested in imagining and sketching these with different kinds of people. Not just myself as designer, the designers in King or Queen, they're actually facilitators to work with biologists, chefs, anthropologists, policymakers. But if you still think about this way, to Judith's point, it's still very discipline-based. But I'm interested in new kinds of areas, new territories, like blurring this boundary between biology and chef. Like, is there a biodesigner? New topics like food architect or sensory historian. Maybe there is a sensory historian. But a smell startup, what does that look like? Or a well-being policymaker. How can these things mishmash and begin to make sense in the new kind of future? And the way I do that, and the way I'm interested in participating in that, is to involve people of different backgrounds, and to sketch ideas together. Here, with Ginkgo Bioworks scientists, we sketched desirable futures, but also undesirable futures. And this was just with paper, and we designed these different kinds of objects. Another example is we designed kind of, what could a future of a sense object be? And we collaborated with Extrapolation Factory, with Chris Wobkin, and we brought these kind of analog objects. And just for people to even give form to their thinking was really important. Or have people think about smell and begin to communicate it in this new way. And these are people of different backgrounds. You could call this workshops. And so that's kind of where I'm at. And lastly, I'm a judge this year, a jury at Core 77 Design Awards, which in the design world is like a big deal, but in your world is like nothing, so it's all good. But I like it because it's about design education initiative, and there's no category on food or chefs, so I'm really excited to bring that and begin to involve and bridge these gaps between everyone. Thank you.